Brilliant. So welcome everybody. It's great to have you in this session, in which we are here. This is a roundtable discussion of the HDCA Global Dialogues 2021, which we aim to explore the connections and applications of the capability approach in urban development and planning. We will do that by discussing my recently published book entitled Cities for Human Development, a Capability Approach to City Making, and situating the book in relation to other contributions and dialogues in the intersection between the debates on capabilities and cities. I will start now sharing my screen so that we can go through this. So I will start with a brief outline of the main arguments of the book, and then we will have inputs from colleagues part of the Human Development and Capability Network, examining how the urban has been and could be addressed by the capability approach literature. So thank you so much, Mario Biggeri, Andrea Ferrannini, Claudia Basta, and PB Anand for being here today with us. After that, we will have inputs from key urban thinkers and practitioners. We will reflect about what they see as the contribution of the capability approach towards the thinking and practice of urban development. And thank you so much, Rubbina, Karruna, Jaideep, Gupte, and Adriana, for your time and for being here. So welcome to this panel. So let me start with the main argument of the book. Well, in the early 2000s, while doing research in an informal settlement in Salvador da Bahia in Brazil, local residents explained to me what happened in a Sunday afternoon. Often a family that needed to expand their house, building an extra floor, would cook a big pot of feijoada, which for those who know, it's a kind of big dish of beans with rice, and their neighborhoods would come to help. Through this process, people would talk, build relationships, learn from one another. Later, these same relationships would be used to fight against the threat of evictions and to demand from local authorities better access to water, sanitation, schools, and healthcare. In a context of violence and insecurity, that extra floor becomes a way to keep relatives close in ways that they can support with everyday responsibilities of care. And then they explained to me how an upgrading project moved people into a housing state designed without any meaningful participation of local residents, which did not allow for incremental improvements, where poor communal water and sanitation infrastructure led to constant blockages, all resulting in conflicts among residents and deepening mistrust with local authorities. During interviews with key informants, I also became aware of future plans to transform this part of the city into a potential touristic region, and that the upgrading process was seen as a first stage into activating the exchange value of the area for future investments. Inevitably, many residents that moved into the housing state could not afford anymore to live there and end up having to go to further locations, more marginalized, disrupting social networks and livelihoods. It was through this story that I started to explore the connections between city making and the distribution of opportunities for people to live a good life. For those interested in advancing human development, this book outlines that national social and welfare policies are not enough to disrupt the injustices taking place in cities. Human development literature and practice need to engage much more closely with how cities are being made. The book draws on a series of references from the field of urban studies and planning to illustrate how market-led approaches to the production of space, prioritizing exchange versus the use value of land and space, have led to dispossession, intensifying social and spatial segregations, and compromising equitable distribution of capabilities in cities. At the same time, the book illustrates how everyday and collective practices of city making have been building capability trajectories, disrupting cycles of exclusion, enabling emancipation and human flourishing. In this sense, the book calls for the need to urbanize the capability approach, and therefore better recognize how the production of space is a locus of struggle for human development. It also argues that human development and capability literature needs to embrace a form of spatial consciousness. Spatial consciousness is a concept used by Edward Sawyer to highlight that space is filled with politics and privileges, ideologies and cultural collisions, utopian ideals and dystopian oppression, justice and injustice, oppressive power, and the possibility for emancipation. The book offers a methodological device to urbanize the capability approach. In making this operation, I found a few points of disjunction and convergence between the capability approach and urban development and planning disciplines, which I would like to explore with you here today. Firstly, I argue that the capability approach has been disregarded by various authors writing on the notion of just city on unfair basis. In my view, there has been three misconceptions by this literature that have led to the dismissal of the capability approach. And I'm going to go through the three of them, hopefully quickly now. Firstly, some authors have argued that the capability approach is too universalistic. This critique comes from a few authors responding to how Susan Feinstein used Martha Nussbaum's list of central capabilities to devise rules that can govern the evaluation of urban policy and provide content to the demands of urban movements. Connolly and Steele writings on searching for the just city responds to Feinstein's use of Nussbaum's list by arguing that the capability approach lacks situatedness and embeddedness into social relations, historical and spatial specificities. However, by focusing purely on Nussbaum's work, Feinstein, Connolly, and Steele missed the opportunity to engage with the rich discussion that has been taking place within the Human Development and Capability Network about diverse and situated ways of identifying, exploring, and expanding capabilities. For example, some of us have been focusing on the discussion and expansion of capabilities through localized and situated grassroots and participatory practices. For example, Biggeri and Ferrannini work on sustainable human development has been a key contribution to localizing the capability approach through a people-centered and territorial perspective. Their work demonstrates that people's capabilities and agencies are embedded in and conditioned by territories. The second misconception about the capability approach found in urban development literature is that it is too individualistic, and as a result, it does not provide a meaningful account of the collective processes or social relations that shape diverse experiences in the city. Again, this has been a deeply debated issue within the capability approach. Various authors have questioned this individualistic tendency by exploring relational aspects of capabilities, proposing concepts like collective, group, relational, external capabilities. The work of Anand, for example, here with us today as well, has been extremely important, articulating collective capabilities as rights of present as well as future generations. Finally, a third misconception comes from the critique made by Asher Min, a leading urban theorist, who argues that the capability approach puts too much emphasis on the agency of individuals to bring about change and does not focus enough on structural analysis and actions. Amin argues that sense thinking can lead to concessionism urbanism, focused on punctual, project-based and localized interventions, potentially leaving wider unjust urban development tendencies unchallenged. I believe that Amin's critique relates to the misappropriation of sense work by some development agencies rather than the content of the capability approach. Sense writings on famine is a structural and historical analysis of the causes of people's lack of entitlements to access food in India. Since then, other important contributions in the capability approach have also addressed structural injustices, like the book entitled Transforming Unjust Structures, added by Séverine Denolin, Matthias Nabir, and Nicholas Sagoski. For Ash Amin, sense work does not tackle structural drivers of urban injustice because it does not explicitly call for the states to protect and promote human rights in the city. However, I would argue with Anand that the capability approach is actually a useful tool for advancing rights-based agenda. Denolin goes in a similar direction, and she establishes various useful connections and complementarities between the right to the city and the discourse and sense work. In the book, I advance this argument by saying that the capability approach is a right-based framework that connects people's experiences and aspirations with states' commitments and obligations. After exploring these misunderstandings, of the capability approach in urban development and planning, let's move on to the second point I would like to share with you today. The book outlines in response to the need to move the capability approach away from a purely evaluative framework towards a way of thinking projectively. By bringing debates from the disciplines of architecture, design, and planning into capability discussions, I felt that the evaluative manner within which Sen's work have been applied was not able to capture the dynamics of producing and appropriating space. The focus on resources and people's command over particular goods have led to policy-oriented evaluations that articulate how redistributive policies can better meet the needs of those being left behind. However, the capability approach has not been able to help us to interrogate more centrally the ways of doing things. For example, it can help us to identify which groups have not been able to benefit from housing policies and reveals the reasons why that happened, but does not help us in designing housing options that better advance people's capabilities and their right to access adequate housing. In the book, I centered the application of the capability approach not on goods and services, but on diverse modalities of spatial production. By doing this, the book examines governance arrangements and their implications to capability expansion. Therefore, the book hopes to move the debate from the what to the how services and goods should be delivered in the city. Meanwhile, in urban planning literature, the conceptualization and interrogation of what constitutes urban practice has been critical to decolonize urban planning and recognize diverse ways and expertise of producing the city. I draw particularly on the work that Adriana, here with us as well today, did in recognizing diverse practices of delivering and managing water and sanitation services in peri-urban areas of cities of the Global South. There have been some efforts within the human development capability literature to work in a similar direction. I am thinking, for instance, of the analysis of grassroots social innovation carried out by Sandra Boni and her colleagues in Valencia, as well as Andy Dong and Ilse Osterlaken work on capabilities and design. I hope this book contributes to this direction. The third point I would like to share is the usefulness of Sen's notion of cooperative conflict in this operation to apply the capability approach to the debates in the planning discipline. I think that the most explicit dialogue between planning theory and the capability approach has been to date done by Claudia Basta, and thank you for joining us today as well, in her article published in 2016 about planning for justice. There, she argues that it is crucial for planning interventions to focus not only on the delivery of spatial goods, but on how people make use of them to achieve the things they value. The implications here are that planning should not end with the delivery of goods, but also support the enabling conditions that would allow people to enjoy such goods in ways that advance capabilities equitably in the city. In the book, I try to go a step further in this argument by connecting the debates in planning theory that highlights that planning interventions and their impacts on people's capabilities are shaped by power asymmetries. I refer here to critiques of collaborative planning, which argue that its emphasis on consensus building obscures social complexities and limits the recognition of social diversity. I also introduce the various post-collaborative planning references that have called for other ways of conceiving planning, by not attempting to resolve conflict, but navigate through it as a means to recalibrate power symmetry shaping city making. And it is in relation to this debate that Sen's notion of cooperative conflict makes an important contribution. The concept describes gender-based bargaining processes among household members and sheds light on the nature and consequence of trade-offs associated with the acts of cooperation and conflict. This notion of cooperative conflict made in the 90s an important contribution to gender studies and feminist economics, as it portrays women affected by intra-household oppressions, not as passive household members, but as careful agents considering when and how to contest power symmetries, giving their room for maneuver and the potential consequences of their acts. Applying this notion to planning debates means shedding light to the interface between agonistic and collaborative forms of planning. This can help, for example, to rethink collective action and co-production in ways that recognize city-wide conflict and trade-offs. Finally, I would like to say that this book is coming out in the midst of COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has widened social and economic disparities and so raised awareness of the urgent need to address urban inequalities. Many visions of how inequalities should be addressed are emerging. Some argue that we should return to business as usual because we were on the right path before the pandemic. Others emphasize that the crisis is an opportunity to steer away from unjust and unsustainable urban development. The post-pandemic urban recovery agenda will be a contested one, and it's fundamental that care, solidarity, and human development are not set aside in the name of financial recovery. The pandemic reminds us that our past, present, and future depend on what happens not only in places close to us, but also elsewhere. Slogans such as "leave no one and no place behind" and "we are not safe until everyone is safe" need to go beyond rhetoric and be translated into concrete urban policy and planning programs. My hope is that this book can contribute to this journey and support reflection on how to put human development, rather than economic growth, at the center of future urban recovery and urban development pathways. So I would like now to call for our discussants to start their inputs in the panel. And we will start from Mario Biggeri and Andrea Ferrannini. They are both based in the University of Florence, and Arco Lab, who is a very interesting entity that works, it's like a spin-off in the University of Florence, working in the field of human development, both locally as also internationally. So yeah, I'm over to you, Mario and Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I share I have done a very short presentation, which I would like to share with you. First of all, I would like to thank all of you, and I think, well, it is very nice to be here. When Alex asked me to be part of this panel, I was very happy, and it's obviously due to two reasons. One reason is that he is a good friend, but this is not sufficient. I really esteem him very much, not just as a friend, but also as a colleague, and I have learned a lot from him. And this is why I really appreciate also the book. The book is a book that is going to really challenge us again, because one of the characteristics of Alex is that he's challenging. Well, we are challenging each other in the sense that we are trying to make us really more, we can say also sometimes provocative, but in the positive sense, that makes people really think about issues that you haven't thought before. So I'm very happy to be here. I think you can see my presentation. And the idea of Alex is really to go beyond the standards way of looking at things that are happening. And there are two words that always come to my mind when I think about Alex. One is the levers. The idea that you need to have something that is going to change the asymmetric power that we are challenged by. And the other is a space of maneuver. It's not just a question of changing, but creating the space where people can talk about their place where they live, which is the things that is most important for them, where they are proximate to other people, to institutions, and where they get their capabilities, and where they get their opportunities. And the opportunity also to be an agent is something that is very important for us, and especially in the work of Alex. The book has very interesting theoretical chapters, and as well interesting examples and practical work that he has done in the field for many years. And very often we work together with extraordinary results. And what is good of these extraordinary results that sometimes they didn't get any publication out of them, but we learned a lot from each other and from the people we were talking to and with. And this is Alex, and this is why I'm happy to be here. And happy because the book is challenging again us, and is opening our idea of the city and idea of the people. It's something with my colleague Andrea Ferrannini as well we have discussed a lot in the past, and we think that aspiration and drivers of change are so important. What I like more than what I do usually is that Alex works in situation of conflict, open conflict very often, which very often I do not. I do help local and communities to try to find their way, but where usually conflict is limited. While the work that Alex has done is very much in those areas when there is a lot of tension very often, and when the aspiration of people cannot be called aspiration if they do not do collective action, and if they do not think about via collectivity, and thus we have to use other terminology and other concept that helps the capability approach to maintain his capacity as a let's say analytical approach that help us to go further. So the standard capability approach we do not like. As Alex, I was impressed by the people living. In this case, is Kampala, is Uganda, is many years ago. And we were working with children of the street, children in the street, and so on. And it was impressive, the knowledge they had about their town and what they could get from something and what they could not get in one area or in a different area. This means that we have to listen to people. This means that the focus group were clearly telling us, look, mobility is not just deprivation. Mobility is an opportunity for children. Children of the street had more opportunity than other children to experience their own town and to take the children's choice and their preferred places. So this was challenging me, because you are thinking that children of the street were all deprived in everything, but not in mobility. Well, I don't want to open anything, but this is something that is really making us thinking a lot. And when I say thinking a lot, well, with Alex, we were really talking, and with Andrea Ferrannini, we developed this framework that is a sustainable territorial evolution for human development. And the idea that I appreciate of Alex, that in especially chapter in page 15, he's looking at disentangling the different processes and drivers, and as well as aspiration as a keywords to change. And indeed, if we stick on the capability approach that is individual, we look at conversion factors, we look at social and economic, social and environmental conversion factors, but we do not really enter in what the capability approach, I think, and we think is. It is something different. It is an opportunity to rethink about our, not just individual capabilities, but about our capabilities with the capabilities of the other people, which brings back our attention to what Sen was saying, that we are social, and we cannot think about individualistic way of thinking. Another things I cannot go in detail is that open up to collective dynamic, local dynamics, which is where the urban settlement take place and where most of the our capabilities come from. But without the capability that you understand that the achieved functioning of the territory, you will never understand what are the real capability. And you learn why there are different processes that brings to maybe conflict, but as well, there are opportunities to introduce synergic development. And then there is obviously the extra local level, which is important. So when we talk about the city, we are here where I've written local dynamics, and you have feedback loops. So what is important, and what I have learned in the work of Alex, is the dynamic that we are facing when we are doing an analysis of a town or a rural area or a community. We feel that, and we tend to see things in a static way, but is in reality very much dynamic, and is very much linked to the aspiration. But the aspiration are not just individual. So what you would like to achieve, what you cannot achieve, so is not in your capability set. It is also at the local level. It's not a question that you want to be secure in you want to be secure as a community. It's not that you want good relation alone as individual. You want good relation within your community. And these open up to a very different approach, where it's not just a question of individual capabilities, but you have to think and to find the solution for individual capability passing through the community capabilities and collective dynamics. So there is no point in creating a process of change if you don't give the opportunity to the community to create their own levers for change and space of maneuver. And these are the words of Alex, which I really like. So I give the floor to Andrea, and I really thank you, Alex, for inviting me.
Perfect. Let me quickly conclude, and obviously thanks to HDCA for organizing this session, and thanks Alex for the book, especially, which it's really a important step ahead in this debate. And thanks also for inviting us to, as a community, to discuss about the need to urbanize the capability approach. In your introduction, I really appreciate the misconception, the misunderstandings that you have highlighted, because I think that as a community, we are 47 people right now. Probably we fully agree on these misconceptions, but it's important that we all raise a voice together to make them clear to the overall debate, and which has gained a very important momentum right now about the importance of the urban setting, the importance about urbanizing the capability approach, and also, as you said, about the importance of spatial consciousness. Probably the pandemic has made us realize that individuals, made us increase as individuals this spatial consciousness. But I think that as a community of scholars, of policymakers, of organizations, I see here that are attending also people from United Nations agencies, from Association of Local and Regional Governments. We are all aware about this spatial consciousness, and we are all continuing to make this increase with the wider general public in the academia and outside the academia. There are four main insights I want to share with you about why we should urbanize the capability approach, and I think they are all very, very evident also in Alex's book and in a lot of the publications that this group of people have released in the past few years. So first concerns governance and planning, where it's important to recall that governance is not just government, it's not just about the role of the public sector. So in the urban setting is where the governance conceptualization of joint efforts between public authorities and active citizenship is more clear, is more evident. It's also easier in some way, but also where the conflicts, as Alex said, are even more evident and important. So we need to urbanize the capability approach because an urban setting, the governance matters a lot for the expansion of individual and collective capabilities. I really appreciate the way that Alex has stressed in his book and his previous publication the concept of institutional capabilities. I think this is a very relevant concept that was strongly needed in the debate because it makes more clear the role of all of us in expanding individual and collective capabilities in urban settings. And I also appreciate from your presentation before that the starting point of expanding individual institutional capabilities are the feijoada, like in Salvador de Bahia. So the social relations among people is the most important driving force to increase institutional capabilities and the role of public institutions, the roles of communities for expanding capabilities. Second argument is that we are now in the decade for action about SDGs, about the promotion of sustainable development, and the urban settings are fundamental for SDG localization. Surely enough, there is a standing debate about the role of local and regional governments for SDGs localization. But here again, if we expand not only to governments, but if we expand to urban communities, there is clear that for all the SDGs, there is a very, very relevant role, which could be a positive role, but also a detrimental role by communities, by urban communities in pushing all the different SDGs. So we need to urbanize the capability approach because this provides a stronger theoretical basis also for SDGs localization, which is highly needed in the debate and in the practice of urban planning. Third argument, as Alex said in his book and his presentation, urban setting should not be seen only as an engine of growth, but let's say today as an engine of resilience, and as Alex said, as an engine of sustainable human development. I think that if we take the 4 pillars of sustainable human development, it's clear that the role that urban communities, urban settings play for these 4 pillars. So it's obviously clear for participation and active citizenship. So in the urban settings is where social relations can nurture collective agency for a change and can allow the participation of all the different social groups, but also can hinder the participation of different social groups. As for the second pillar, equity and all the matters of social inclusions, most of services are provided in urban settings. Most of obstacles, most of inequalities are felt by citizens within the urban settings. So it's clear the connection the urban settings can have in the pursuit of equity. It's also very strong in the matter of productivity and enhancement of value added through ideas that today should go in the direction of pushing sustainable human development. And then the fourth pillar of sustainability, it is evident the role that urban settings play on and can play and should play even more on the protection of natural resources and ecosystems as compared to what happened in the past. So the connection between the urban settings and the 4 pillars of sustainable human development is evident in our daily life, should be even more relevant in the academic debate as we are discussing today, and should be probably the main framework to design policies in urban setting. And I conclude by saying that there is probably a transversal vector that cross all these 4 pillars, which is the innovation vector. So there has been a lot of discussion about the importance of urban settings for innovation processes because of having a lot of people gathering together in the identification of potential solutions. I think this is something that we should recognize and highlight even more, especially because in the urban settings, institutional innovations may appear, not only technological innovation, but also the social innovations that is mentioned also in Alex's book. So this could be a transversal vector for expanding sustainable human development, and urban planning should also be devised to allowing innovations to emerge in the 4 pillars of sustainable human development, and by first of all by allowing even more people to gather together to identify solutions which can be tailored solution for the local context, but then can also be somehow scaled up and expanded to other similar contexts in countries or across countries. So thanks again, Alex, for the invitation, and I look forward to engage with this community of scholars, policymakers today and in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrea and Mario. Wonderful inputs. Andrea, there's a question here for you in the chat around what are the 4 pillars. So maybe while we have the next input, maybe you could articulate that in the chat. And yeah, please keep your questions coming as we're moving forward. And next one is Claudia Basta, who is a researcher at the Department of Spatial Planning and Quality of the Local Environment at the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Claudia, it took me a while to track you down, but I'm happy I found you because yeah, your paper, as I mentioned in my introduction, was crucial in this endeavor, and thank you for joining us. So yeah, I'm handing over to you. Thanks.
Well, I start with a non-banal thank you for having invited me, also because yeah, I'm always a bit surprised that early writings of mine that are kind of dated to 2016 or 2017 yeah, keep being used as a reference in the first place for engendering amazing work as the one you've done. And another absolutely genuine, sincere remark that I have is that I have hardly seen a book being published more timely than the book you are publishing. And I would like to tailor my short contributions to this discussion by starting from why I think so, by reverting on 2 points that you have shared with us, Alex, during your introduction. The first, why do we need to urbanize the capability approach and why it hasn't happened yet? And the second point, I would like to revert a bit on my professional experience in the past few years. As you've said, I have left academia at the end of 2016 to join a National Research Institute, where our main core business, let's say, is to evaluate public policy and the effects of public policy. We are fully governmental, but we are independent in the research agenda that we set. And paradoxically, that's the first institute in which I found full freedom to keep developing my research, my interest in the capability approach. Point one, why urbanizing the capability approach and why that hasn't happened yet within the, let's say, urban planning community, neither at theoretical nor at applied level. Here, I would like to give feedback about this by elaborating a bit on my personal experience. I have a major in urban planning from the University of Venice, so that's basically my whole, the core of my formation, let's say, is in urban and environmental planning. And in the Netherlands, I moved on with a PhD in urban sustainability, so 4 or 5 years of PhD. And then in 2009, I decided to do a postdoctorate specializations in ethics, applied ethics. My roommate happened to be Ilse Oosterlaken, someone you have mentioned during your introduction, Alex. And she was, like me, I think at the time she was just concluding her PhD, but let's say she was busy with this strange, unknown framework called the capability approach. It struck me because the relevance to my own field was immediate for me to recognize, obviously. For any of us, it is. It struck me that neither during my bachelor, nor my master, nor my PhD, I had ever heard about it. And I happened to hear about it only because my roommates during my postdoc, so at the relatively mature stage of studying and education, she was working on it. So I started thinking on it straight away. I nearly abandoned what I was supposed to do during my postdoc to learn as much as possible of it. Until in 2011, I started my tenure track at Wageningen University with a research statement wholly grounded on why I wanted to do my 6th year of tenure track on the capability approach. For my tenure track, I obviously joined a spatial planning department. So my professor was a planner, my colleagues were urban planners, and I basically fell back into a situation before my postdoc. So I have met 2 things: skepticism about the, let's say, suitability and relevance of the capability approach due to ignorance of the approach. That was ignorance not with a negative connotation, it was just unknown within the discipline. So they were saying, why do you want to allocate so much time and energies to it? And the second attitude, which came up a bit later when I had a new professor chairing my group, was an outspoken hostility to it. And the arguments that I was proposed for motivating this hostility is one of the 3 arguments you have mentioned, Alex, that was that it is an individualistic framework. So it's basically wholly grounded on individualistic conception of societal dynamics, etc., etc. That's still the case. In my opinion, in the urban planning, spatial planning community, especially in the communities of theoreticians, there is still hostility towards the capability approach because it is experienced as a framework engendered within a liberal worldview, and that is, from the analytical point of view, grounded on, in fact, the primacy of the individual as the unit of analysis of any evaluation. This is something that only a very small minority of theoreticians in the urban and spatial planning community would embrace, really from the worldview point of view. And it is at the basis, I do believe, of all the misunderstandings and wrong or partial readings that you have already discussed with us, Alex. So I'm not going back to them. I just wanted to start from my personal experience, because I think it really gives a meaningful example of what can mean for a spatial planner to wanting to embark on developing the approach. I did it with a lot of, as I said, climate of hostility around me until I was, obviously struggling with all the hardship of the tenure track. I was able to produce a couple of theoretical writings about it until I left academia. Really tired and also a bit discouraged actually by the fact that I was encountering so much resistance and that I nearly decided to abandon it. In 2010, I joined a National Research Institute, which is busy with policy analysis and policy evaluation from a scientific perspective. So we are analysts, but most of us are scientists. So we do produce output that can be published in scientific journals or national magazines, doesn't matter, but we are in fact a research institute. The moment that I spoke about the capability approach, how much I would have wanted to pick it up in my hands again, and the literature was growing, etc., I have found open arms. The reason why I found open arms takes me to reflect a bit with you on the second point of why we need to urbanize the capability approach. The capability approach offers us, in my opinion, but obviously that echoes the most important and authoritative opinion of Alex, it bridges, it fills gaps that the practice of evaluation in planning has always struggled with, but hasn't yet found a way forward, nor an agreed way forward. It enables to not only evaluate the effects of urban policies, tailoring the evaluation according to different social groups, but for me, it also enables the bridge between urban planning and urban design. So we are finally able to bring together the two dimensions that have been the most conflicting, separate, and apart in the whole, I'm speaking of the theoretical debate here in urban planning. I think it's able to bring them together by proposing practices of evaluations that look simultaneously at different social groups, the different effects that certain institutions, and for example, I can think of the construction codes. I will give a concrete example of why in my agency we're busy with that. And also regarding the accessibility to certain forms of guaranteed participation into spatial planning policies. I would like to focus on, I would like to give a concrete example of why my institute was so positive about it, which is a typical difficulty when it comes to evaluate a spatial planning policy. In this case, a housing policy. As you know, probably the Netherlands has suffers from a chronic shortage of social housing, so affordable housing accessible to groups that, because of income, age, or also impairments. So there is really a quantitative shortage. But the truth is that there is also a qualitative shortage in the sense that not everybody has the capabilities to access the housing policy systems and to just start up a procedure to apply for it, for example. The capability approach offers us evaluative means by which we can really tailor questions of accessibility and capabilities of participations into the access to primary goods that no other framework had offered us before. So that's an example, for example, of a project that in which my agency has welcomed the capability approach thinking. Another one, very important topic, is the topic of broad welfare. And all the projects that in our case gravitate around the questions of welfare in relations to municipal and provincial planning. So from the small scale of densification of urban neighborhoods, for example, to the larger scale of the provision of transport infrastructures at regional level. Provinces in the Netherlands are corresponding of regions in other European countries. Also here, we have initiated a whole project that tries to bring, even though the scale is the regional scale, that tries to bring in individuals' perspectives regarding their ability to move and therefore to having the freedom to decide where to live, beyond considerations of how long do I have to commute to reach my workplace, for example. So we are bringing together these two methods of analysis. So the sampling of people's direct experiences with the ability to evaluate the effects that the allocations of funds for expanding the transport network have on these specific groups. I could go on forever. What I'm trying to say is the capability approach offers us a perspective, an outlook on typical, very mainstream planning questions with which planners are busy every day, and it gives us instruments to tailor our analysis of the problem and our feedback in terms of the effectiveness and viability of certain policies in a very comprehensive way, in the sense that it enables us to bring in people's perspectives, individuals' experiences, obviously without using the term individuals here in the negative connotations within which it is connoted in a given worldview. And it also enables us to really differentiate per different groups. At the moment, just to conclude, when you remember Claudia, 2011, nobody speaking about the capability approach in the Netherlands. Now we have PhD programs. I am supervising one myself from TU Delft, a PhD project that looks at area development, so the micro scale, and the gap between the ambitions of micro plans, so the micro scale of planning, and whether or not the effect, the gap between the ambitions and the capabilities that these projects enable. And that's become absolutely welcome also in the Dutch academia as a project. We have a whole project, institutionalized project, running into my agencies that looks at capabilities. What we missed was, what I missed also in my work, was a book to give to my colleagues every time they want to, every time they pose the common question, what is the capability approach? And I never read about it into mainstream planning literature, etc. Now we have your book, Alex. So it's a tool that we finally have really at disposal to expand and cement more and more the idea that the capability approach doesn't have to be approached from a political worldview, doesn't have, to be connoted in a certain way because of the diversity and pluralism of political worldviews. It is an instrument that brings us to simultaneously evaluate effects on the ground, but also ethical issues related to why we plan the way we plan and for whom we are planning. And with this, I would like just to go back to where I started. Thank you, Alex, for this book. It is a greatly timely book, and I'm really happy to discuss about it with you today.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for your inputs. And it's fantastic to hear about also your personal experience of being exposed and using the capability approach in your areas of work and action. So thanks for sharing that with us. Now, PB Anand from the University of Bradford, who is, well, I'm borrowing the title of a chapter that he wrote in a recent published book called Citizen Capabilities, and I basically plagiarized that for the title of this session, because also it was, again, another milestone in this process, a fantastic contribution to this debate. And yeah, PB has been writing in this field for a while already, and he's also worked in the national human development reports as well, very much grounded in practice. So fantastic to have you here with us, and yeah, your encouragements and frustrations has been always part of this journey of thinking about citizen capabilities. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much for inviting me, giving me an opportunity in this forum, and also huge congratulations to you for completing and bringing out this book in the middle of the pandemic and various challenges. So huge respect. So I really appreciate. I want to share my screen. Let's see if it works. Does it work? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So let me also start my timer so that obviously this is a topic that's very dear to many of us, and there are many things we could say. I thought I will just share some frustrations, and from that, some kind of ideas. Obviously, I acknowledge British Academy grant, which made it possible, and also we were very delighted and had many opportunities to present this, including in the Cambridge Capability conferences that Mario and various people attended. And the chapter that Alex mentioned is in the book that came out of one of the Cambridge Capability conferences, led by Flavio Shailija, in which I participated as well. And also good news that our book has just recently, the paperback has come out, which is much more accessible. These forums, have given us opportunity to share some of the insights, but also kind of the frustrations. Frustrations because, like my colleagues have mentioned before, here is a framework. At the back of, Lord of the Rings book, when you see, it is mentioned that the world is divided into two groups, those who have read it and those who haven't. I think capability approach is very much like that. When we are talking to our other colleagues, etc., it seems that most of the colleagues, including in social sciences departments, have heard of capability approach, but really have never gone deeper into beyond some very basic understanding. So that really frustrates us, because here is a framework, number one, in the context of anti-racist university or decolonization, etc. Here's a framework that is grounded in the understanding of the causes of famines and the failure of individual agency, and how systematic kind of inequalities have been kind of perpetuated. So grounded very much in the work from, if you like, from Africa, from Asia. And here is a huge opportunity, because it brings in both the normative and positive dimensions, and it is, it hasn't been appreciated or ignored. So that's what I think is the frustration. So in that context, the more we have books such as Alex's, definitely it's going to be very, very helpful. Since it's approaching 11 o'clock, it's coffee time usually in UK. So I just want to start with the story of this coffee. So, I like coffee very much, and, I had opportunities before pandemic to visit Italy very regularly, colleagues at Roma Tre, and also visited Mario's department. So obviously we envy Italians for this wonderful coffee culture they have. So I bought this Loaza thinking that, okay, at least I can have a taste of this. But when you notice actually carefully, it says it's made in Brazil, and then it is packaged in Poland. So, the taste of coffee, until then I was thinking this is Italian coffee. So since then my perception began to change. So we live in a very much a connected world. And this kind of a messy, complex kind of urban world is what, we are trying to get to grips with and trying to implement. In my view, capability approach, I think, has this potential, as Alex in the book has shown through the various case studies, ability to understand this complexity and address the issues related to justice, which are most important. So it helps us to unravel that complexity. And that's why I think it is a huge opportunity. There's a lot of discussion on sustainable cities, but again, like me, I'm sure you are frustrated, because a lot of it seems to be, if it's presented as a kind of this very elite kind of solution, the ideal solution. If you can design something from scratch, oh, that's the best solution. Otherwise, stick some kind of solar panels and then call your city a sustainable city. But unfortunately, all this greenwash does not make a sustainable city. We know that the three pillars earlier also, there are 4 pillars have been mentioned. So, okay, we can add the justice dimension, equity as well, but as part of social. But I think all 3 pillars are equally important, and that is sometimes, kind of forgotten. So if I have to simplify these discussions, so because world is so messy and complex, we need some kind of a formula or a science of cities. So my formula would be something like this. So it's if you want to achieve sustainable cities, so it has at least these 5 dimensions. So we'll say P, S, S, C, G. So what are these? It's easy to remember. So P is the people-centered. I think that becomes first one. It has to be the focus of that. I have read many papers and models, etc., where it's kind of, people are either taken for granted or it's very top-down kind of an approach. So I think that has to be resisted. So it has to be people-centered and bottom-up. And again, the case studies, both the Uganda case study that Mario mentioned about, and Alex's book is full of these kind of examples. And the very, example you started with very at the very beginning, I think that puts right at the center of people-centeredness as the, kind of a fundamental starting point. Again, scale and space, these are very important. Space, I think already Alex mentioned earlier as well. But these, I think, are, in my view, important, but they need to be subsumed with the idea of people. Here, I think one of the most fundamental challenges for us is to understand why cities are, have become so important and thriving. I mean, the City of Lights, this is a famous satellite picture, I think, captures this whole idea of urban growth and over a period of time. And therefore, this is a kind of world urbanization for various countries. When you look at it, when I saw this picture of a messy street, in northern India, for me, the left-hand picture is what I remember always, because I think our urban world is complex. There are many countries going through different kinds of urbanization patterns. Most of them are going through this kind of becoming urbanized, not necessarily through policy, maybe not necessarily by design, but nevertheless, they're going through. And then when we pick, patterns, for example, there are countries which have, urbanized more than 50%. And then there are some countries which have de-urbanized as well. So it's not as if it's, every country is going through the same pattern. So this kind of a context also matters. And, this is, I think, is very interesting. This is just in 4 years in India, we can see the significant difference in the amount of lighting that reflects the urban activity. It's going at a scale that, it requires comprehension. And we also know from European kind of analysis that city size and ecological footprint may not be, related. Some smaller cities can have very huge, high ecological footprint than bigger ones. So that means, it's not necessarily big is bad or small is good kind of a thing. Finally, I just want to mention, the car dependence, because in the context at the moment, we are just looking at this whole idea of transition to decarbonization. But why is car so important? I think it is because, not just because of anything else, it's partly because of lack of alternative forms of transportation, but also I think it is also an expression of individual agency, why individual agency is very important. And if systems fail to address that or provide that, then I think, people have to depend on alternative forms of enhancing their agency. So these are kind of some of the, just very simple examples I wanted to. Before I conclude, I just wanted to remind we all know that, but I think, again, it's worth mentioning. Cities has this kind of complex system. So there are overlays of different systems. I do a lot of work on smart cities, and in smart cities, you always talk about this idea of overlaying layers. But I think what is forgotten is that we also have this historical and kind of geographical layers and physical layout, for example, much difficult to change. But the invisible forms of systems are the cities as an economic system, for example. Again, within that, you have subsystems, employment, labor markets, market for space and allocation. So the frame of Alonso model, and we can see that very easily. And then the markets for goods and services. So these kind of overlap, but these are individual systems. So if we don't understand those and then try to kind of how they interact, that's what I think, leads to this kind of a static view of cities. And then in the ecological kind of literature, we see city as an ecosystem. I have done a lot of work on water scarcity, trying to unravel water scarcity and the role of entitlements. My first book was on, applying entitlements analysis in relation to water scarcity. And that again shows that cities have this, there's a lot of almost like a local hydrological cycle. So in the context of circular economy that is now presently being discussed, in reality, ultimately, the ultimate test of a circular economy is how a city can transform a linear system of water using fresh water and dumping kind of a wastewater, how it can close the loop. The ideal circular economy will be a city that doesn't waste even a drop of water, so which doesn't require. But we are not there yet. We are very, very far away from that. The other ecological footprint, the waste, I think again, it's a very interesting thing. There is some kind of a circularity, but it's a global circularity. We produce a lot of paper waste, and all this paper goes to another country where it's churned and maybe it's made into paper. So every time we are buying paper, it says it's recycled paper, but it's not locally recycled, it's globally recycled. It's fine, everything doesn't have to be locally recycled, but that means the city is part of these kind of various loops. Some are global, some may be regional, European level, and some may be local. So I think understanding those also is very important, and how each of those cycles can produce haves and have-nots, or create marginalization, and who is bearing ultimately the burden of that. So I think waste is becoming really a very important issue, because it is in a way like a NIMBY. We all think that we are recycling plastic, but actually in UK, for example, the number of types of plastic used in packaging are more than 100. So colleagues in my polymer engineering, they're telling us it could be nearly 200, but we don't have capacity to recycle all of them within the UK. So by definition, a lot of that plastic, we think it is recycled, we are recycling it, but I think it just being exported elsewhere, and it becomes somebody else's problem. So I think these kind of contexts, that's why we need theories or models that can help reduce this complexity and enable us to inform policy. And that's where I think the capability approach enables us to focus on who benefits, who loses, where is deprivation, and why it is there. I think those kind of questions, again, Alex mentioned about the why and how questions, I think both are equally important, and the capability approach, in my view, can enable us. I work in Bradford, so, and we are always exercised by this. So I always think, am I so, only half as productive as Alex? It may well be true, because, he's writing very well. But I hope, that that's not at the level of individual. I think this kind of the productivity that exercised Arthur Lewis in trying to understand cities, I think is also related to the kind of cities as opportunities for agency enhancing networks. So here I have just kind of projected the city as kind of lights and the brain, neurons imaging. So these kind of agglomeration economies are basically the opportunities to connect, interact, and exchange ideas. And that's what sparkles the creativity, just like our neurons in the brain fire the more connections we make. So I think that space is what a city offers. And those opportunities, that means, again, coming back to our capability perspective, the more opportunities we can give to people for those connections and enhancing agency, sharing, being able to participate, being being recognized as a valued member of the society, being listened to, for example. I think these are very, very important parts of the well-being agency freedoms, which a city can offer. And I think that's where the city. So ultimately, if people say that, what can a capability approach tell me from, with regard to cities? I think, ultimately we have to say, okay, one of the greatest freedoms is the freedom to live, and if we can't show that cities lead to longer life expectancy, then we are not able to show that cities enhance our freedom. So there's some work that I have presented in the chapter I have mentioned, but we know also from the work of UCL Lancet Commission, such urban advantage is not automatic. It has to be actively created and maintained through policy. And that's where I think, we can actually dug deep into some of these. And there are countries which have urbanized a lot, but hardly life expectancy changed in 50 years, not even by a little. And some other countries have enhanced, significantly, where life expectancy increased by over 30 years. So that means urbanization process can lead to these freedoms and freedom to live longer if it is managed carefully. So that's what we have to understand, what kind of things can help there. Again, coming back to Bradford, some of the most deprived areas within England are very close to where my university is. We are in one of the most deprived kind of areas. So within that, how a capability approach can offer some explanations. So this is just an map of Bradford and a bus route. I say that in the course of the journey of this bus, which might cost you £2, you will traverse areas which have 14 years of life expectancy difference. And so if we want to really advance well-beings and freedoms in a city, we have to understand why this deprivation exists and why within a city, within 10 miles, there is so much 14 years of life expectancy difference and what we can do about it. So the underlying structural inequalities, the kind of things that Michael Marmot talks about in terms of social determinants of health, how we can understand them and use them in our policy and in planning. I think that's what is going to be crucial. So I think these are some of the things, and I don't need to say any of these. I will just conclude by saying that therefore cities are about connections, but connections means inequality matters a lot. There is a digital divide, there are other forms of divide, so we cannot assume that everybody will have equal access to these connections. So we have to think in terms of to avoid greenwash and to create real sustainable cities, we have to think in terms of all aspects of these, the people, especially focusing on people, space, scale, and complexity, and governance arrangements which are appropriate for that city. I think in all those 5 areas, the capability approach has opportunity or promises potential to contribute. So with that, I will stop. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Anand. Wonderful. And I think it was a great also shift towards positioning us in a conversation also quite clearly within agendas coming from urban development, which you have done. So thank you so much. And I think I will invite now Rubbina Karruna. She's a city advisor from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of UK government, but also she's part of the board of Architecture Sans Frontières UK, an organization that I've been part in working through for the last 10 years, and many of the cases of the book draws on that. And also she was part of some of those workshops that I quote also in the book. So it's great to have Rubbina here with us with this double hat of thinking through this book and the potential contributions it might bring to urban development. So thank you, Rubbina.
Thanks, Alex. And firstly, just to say congratulations on the book, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion today. So I was just really lucky to have the opportunity to read through the book, and I just think it's such a rich set of examples of that kind of the framing of the capability approach around critical urban issues. And also what struck me is just kind of how global the examples are, kind of across continents, and it isn't about a kind of applying this purely in low income or middle income settings, also in high income settings. And it just shows the kind of universal challenges we have around building just cities across continents. And as Alex says, I'm also engaged with ASFUK, where we kind of try and support communities and practitioners to co-design more equitable cities. And so some of the situations in the book I was really familiar with, I was part of those workshops, but it was actually really great to kind of revisit some of that, because it also kind of reminded me of those interactions, but also made me think slightly differently about some of them. And also give me a bit of challenge, because as Alex says, I'm also a cities advisor in a big donor agency. And there can be tensions there, especially when we talk about cities. So when I was thinking about kind of what's the contribution of the capability approach to our practice and thinking about urban development, for me, I think it's about kind of how do we enhance the key building blocks for creating more just cities, and how's the capability approach, how's that been helping us think about and do that? And in particular, I kind of wanted to focus around kind of livelihoods and how we're really defining those, participation and what we mean by that, and also institutions. So on livelihoods, as kind of a lot of us will know on this panel, kind of urbanisation is happening. It's happening fast across many continents, particularly in Africa, where I work currently now based in Ghana. But what we're seeing is an increasing disconnect between the kind of narrative around economic growth, and something that kind of Alex really puts forward really well in the book, and the reality of these cities, the precarious nature of livelihoods within them. And especially as we're kind of seeing cities become these nodes in the global economy, then I think there's increasingly an exclusion of other people within the city, and who really is a citizen. And from a donor agency perspective, we use the kind of sustainable livelihoods framework. That's one that we've used for a long time, particularly in what was UK donor agency DFID, where I've worked. And Alex talks about this in the book as well. And it is a good framing around livelihoods and draws on elements of the capability approach. But for me, when I started as the cities advisor in DFID, it was very much focused on the rural aspect, and it wasn't very rooted in our thinking around urban. And so I therefore thought it was quite limited, for me anyway, or how maybe DFID was applying it. But in particular, that it didn't really consider how do we actually define livelihoods? Who's defining those livelihoods? What do we mean by assets? And what I think the capability approach does is kind of bring more to the fore the human development aspect of this, and who are we asking to define their assets, and actually should be asking the people themselves, particularly because the challenges that people face in cities is the right to just be able to live there, to access services, but also to move within urban space. These are spaces that people produce, but often are challenged to be able to actually move within them themselves, and are kind of made invisible. And so I think the capability approach kind of challenges us to kind of think about the informal, the lack of recognition that the informal economy has, but also think about livelihoods more broadly and not purely a kind of economic productive way. So then on something like participation, this is something that I come up against constantly, where as a cities advisor, we're looking at kind of investment in cities and big infrastructure projects. And you'll often come across projects where they say, yeah, we're going to have a public forum. This is how we're going to engage with people. This is participation. And really, that's just kind of version of consultation and not a particularly meaningful way of thinking about participation. And there's a great example, there's a good examples of this in the book, in particular, example from Euston that Alex talks about, where I was also involved in the workshop, where you have a huge infrastructure project, one of the biggest ones the UK will do around HS2. And it was really going to displace a huge amount of people. And you had a local council that was trying to engage. I think it was genuinely trying to think about how to support these citizens. But their idea of consultation was really, okay, let's get the architects who are going to design some new housing for these communities, come and present the drawings and the plans. But that's not that. No one was really asking them about what their aspirations are. What did they want? What did the housing that they lived in mean for them and their livelihoods and their environment? And so the capability approach for me means doing more meaningful participation. It enables us to kind of have strategies for engaging with more marginalized groups and voices, but also moving beyond that to kind of helping the agents of change and being part of kind of actually driving decision making. And that's definitely something that the work of ASFUK, we've really looked at about kind of considering more meaningful participation, and the workshops that Alex and others have run around thinking about dreaming and aspirations is a really important part of that. And there are examples of that I've seen in my work that we've done, as an example in Monrovia during the pandemic over the last year, where we've supported Wizards Alliance and engagement with communities who needed that better improvements in access to water. But instead of kind of just having quite a top-down approach, it was more about kind of asking them about kind of what their needs were and actually giving them an equal footing at the table with the water utility and the city authorities. So it's about them identifying their needs and how they saw they could correct the issues and giving them agency. And then finally, the issue of institutions. And this is something that I kind of feel like I've thought about a lot over the years, and through my training at the Development Planning Unit. Institutions is always an important part of our discussions and has been with Alex as well. And in my day-to-day job, I interact with many institutions, and you see the power dynamics. In and of itself, the dynamics between a national government and a city government can be really antagonistic and very political. But then the other actors in an urban space, whether it's your utilities or kind of the private sector, and other government agencies. And there's a real kind of asymmetry of power there and lots of vested interest. And I think the capability approach enables us to try and focus on building institutional capability. And Andrea talked about this at the beginning as well. And there's a great example in the book, which is SLURC, the Sierra Leone Urban Research Centre, which was established by people from Freetown with the support of DPU, Comment Relief and others. And what I really like about this example of an institution is that it's trying to be a source of urban knowledge and understanding about the urban process, but it was also kind of co-producing that knowledge with communities, putting them at the forefront and at the centre of the dynamics of what was happening in Freetown, but also became a facilitator, connecting other organisations together, whether it was government or universities or communities. And I think that's a really strong example that I would really like us to learn more from the work of SLURC. And I would really invite those who are here to go and look at some of what they've done, because I feel this is one kind of that continues to be a gap for me, that in other cities that I work with, there needs to be more done to think about kind of institutional capability and what we can learn from this. And then finally, I just wanted to say that in reading the book, I was kind of really struck by something that we should always remember, is that the ideas and practices, that kind of the capability approach in the urban context, and it really comes through in the book, is the kind of how this has emerged through co-production with communities and organizations. These tools and methods and ideas are coming out and through working with others, and it's not purely an academic thing or something that's coming from a particular institution. And that's very, and I think for me, that's very much the essence of what the capability approach is. And I think it's kind of like, congratulations to Alex for really actually bringing that through. And you can kind of really see that in the book. And just finally to say, I think actually reading the book, it's actually a really good challenge for me, because I've haven't studied at DPE for a very long time. I obviously still engage with ASFPK, which is great, but it can be very easy to kind of exist within this kind of donor world, and you kind of think you're doing good things around urban development, but it's a real reminder for me about kind of how we need to put the human development stuff even more front and center. And I hope that I do that every day in my practice, but I kind of think this has been a great opportunity for me to be revisiting some of that. So thanks for the opportunity to contribute today, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Wonderful, Rubbina, fantastic. And thank you so much for wonderful comments and inputs, and sharing also the different encounters that we had in different moments, also that contribute to thinking together for many of those things that you mentioned. Jaideep Gupte, I think it's wonderful to have you with us. You have been a few, when I'm going through the urban development and focused international development, that has actually used well-being thinking in thinking about informal settlements, and your work is again fantastic inspiration and hopefully connections to the book, and it's great to have you. You also made a wonderful acknowledgement for the book that I would like to say thank you very much for that. So yeah, please share your thoughts. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alex, and congratulations to you as well. And as others have said, I mean, this book really comes at a crucial moment, right? A moment where there's deep, almost existentialist questions that are being asked of the development sector. And also, I suppose, congratulate all the speakers thus far for what has been a real tour de force of where we are and where we're headed. Really a moment where collaborative debate, collaborative discussion is so crucial in more ways than one. So I'm really pleased to be here amongst all of you. And Alex, as you said, thank you also to the publishers for sending me an advance copy. I really enjoyed reading this book a few months back. It really helped me through many of these questions that were buzzing around in my head as well. So I wanted to pick up on a couple of entry points, Alex, that you use to help frame your arguments around capabilities and human development. And the first is on sort of a focus on people's aspirations that in some way is in a direct contrast to a paternalistic view of basic needs, right? As you say, sort of this predetermined view of what is a need, what is basic needs. And the second entry point you use that I find of interest here is that a capabilities perspective would not approach these dimensions hierarchically, but in an interconnected and interdependent way. And of course, also placing the notion of what is a good life as a sort of central concern in the making and governance of cities. So with those entry points that you've used so artfully, Alex, so I was thinking on the question you posed us, what are the contributions of this towards thinking and practice around urban development? So 2 points that stood out to me that add to the debate thus far. So many have raised some really important contributions already. So to me, the first sort of advancement of this approach to the thinking and practice around urban development is that it helps us navigate this tension, which I believe is a significant tension that others have alluded to as well, but it arises between a purely relativist approach and the need to uphold certain universalist knowledges. And I don't say that lightly, right? So this really means that public reasoning, as you put it, the sort of methods to sort of help us navigate between a variety of relativist approaches needs to happen locally and non-locally, right? Or across various localities. And this isn't simply a methodological concern, though I fully take that a large part of it is in how it is done. The challenge to me is that participation is still understood as a tool to sort of deliver interventions rather than as the practice itself. It's understood as a method rather than as emancipation. The reason that emancipatory methods are employed as tools, and as you pick up on this point, Alex, as well, is simply to reconfirm preconceived objectives and validate a particular type of interventionism. And this is the type of interventionism that, I acknowledge is being questioned to a deep and fundamental level at the moment. The risk, of course, to such an approach is that preconceived objectives will not be reconfirmed, and that communities will voice alternative approaches or different objectives altogether. So it's at this level that the tension of significance arises between this purely relativist approach and the need to uphold some universalist knowledge, as I was saying. So in using a subjective, I suppose, well-being approach in urban practice, so by this I mean an engagement with what people value and their objective achievement on those values. So the difficulty here is that in achieving a sense of aggregation, I suppose, across sites, in cities, across the city as the scale, indeed across cities as well. So there are fundamental questions about economies of scale, and PB mentioned some of these before, around the provision of basic services, for example, that come into question unless we have this sense of aggregation, right? The ability to meaningfully connect local to the non-local, but sort of not in a nominal way, in a way that, or in a way that simply acknowledges that there are differences, but with very tangible requirements to actually physically align those differences in processes of production and governance across the local, across the non-local, across sites that may not prioritize the same things, right? That's a very concrete need that we have. So you referred to some of the work on well-being that we've been doing, and an example of this tension arose through that, where it was a sort of comparative take across 14 sites, across 7 cities, also spread across a variety, a couple of countries. This meant that aggregation was possible, or I suppose probable, from the individual to the community level. So in practice, this meant, who do you speak with? Do you speak with individuals, or do you speak with representatives of the community? And what does it mean when you do one or the other in terms of the socio-political or planning implications? Aggregation was also possible or probable across sites within cities, and this specifically means traversing formalized and informal spaces and sites, right? What does that mean in practice when you contend with spaces and processes of production that are both formal and informal? And of course, aggregation is probable and potential at the subnational, national, transnational scales as well, where the production and governance mechanisms, infrastructures are at times not always aligned. So what we did find that, for example, across these scales, there was significant prioritization of well-being goals in ways that were not consistent with universalist perspectives. Right? So this is something very real that we must contend with if we are to urbanize these approaches. So for example, community members or some communities at large prioritize the ability to practice religion or their religious practices over and above so-called basic needs requirements like access to safe and sustainable sanitation. So how does urbanizing a well-being or capabilities or human development approach provide us with a way forward? To me, it helps us understand where, when, and how we sequence the practice of development. So in this example, the sequence of introducing capacity strengthening or indeed multi-scalar mutual learning on the importance of sanitation, why sanitation is relevant to a wider set of life goals before actually intervening to upgrade sanitation infrastructure becomes apparent. And this isn't, it seems like a fairly benign point, but repeatedly, time after time, we see development intervention, the practice of urban development occur without this iterative process, right? And we've been saying this for well over 30 years and it continues. And to me, one of the challenges of why this has happened is because transdisciplinary mutual learning, right? So where we agree to change one another's mind, not just to say, okay, you've got a different approach, but we're actually agreeing that the civil engineers are agreeing to change their minds on the basis of what social scientists are saying and vice versa. Social scientists, are, me being one, are known for not changing their minds very often. So this is where this is so crucial. Like what we need at the contemporary moment is, and it's significantly underachieved, is to build some sort of ideological, and I say that not without thought, ideological consensus on the sort of aspirations, values, and worth to arrive at some mutually agreed anchoring points. And not to go on at length, but I did want to make a second point on where this leaves us with the practice of urban development and urban development theory. I wanted to introduce a bit more of a nuanced take on the drive, I suppose drive our collective focus towards the epistemic and ontological shifts in bottom-up and action-oriented approaches as the popularity of research from a distance once again increases, right? So it's really been a hard-fought battle, and many of us around the table and our trusted colleagues have fought this battle to break away from the desk-based or armchair experts that used to dominate urban development or broader development arena some decades ago. But this time, the physical and social distancing between research subjects and researchers, between citizens and practitioners, this is being fueled by this increased reliance on digital infrastructures, and of course, heightened to an extreme during the pandemic. But it is a trend which had already taken a hold of international research arenas predating the pandemic. And here, increasingly, we're seeking to rationalize this distance. But there are legitimate concerns around the extent to which distance and research or even distance action research can actually be inclusive and address citizens' lack of agency. And to me, urbanizing capabilities does three things on this specific, and I'll keep these fairly brief. I know we want to get to listening to Adriana as well. I'm very keen to do that. So I think first it helps us navigate the deep and I suppose deepening digital inequalities, right? PB mentioned this. Access to digital infrastructures are deeply unequal, but the inequalities are also in terms of capabilities, right? And there are temporal issues here. So questions around how fast or how often people connect varies a great deal by gender, by socioeconomic status, on the basis of a range of intersectional issues. So there's a set of concerns there that I think we need to be nuanced about. The second area is in navigating the new challenges and the new barriers of advocating for citizens' rights in the digital space. Right? And here again, urbanizing the capabilities approach can provide sort of a focal concentration, if you will, on where advocacy does and doesn't keep pace with innovation, digital innovations or ICT innovations. Equally, and as we've seen repeatedly through the pandemic, on ground, in person, I suppose human scale advocacy has not stopped, right? We cannot just assume everything is digital. We are all in Zoom windows here, but on ground stuff has not stopped, right? It's really important to keep stressing that. We've seen repeatedly across city after city, site after site, informal settlement after informal settlement, right through the pandemic, that the mediating role of community leaders has continued. Or in some cases, it has intensified through lockdowns, right? Right alongside their influence in the digital and ICT-based advocacy space. And I think urbanizing a capabilities well-being approach actually helps us navigate these two worlds in really meaningful ways. And so the last point, and I'll end with this, is that in urbanizing a capabilities approach, that sort of places well-being at its center, to me, it pushes us to recognize blended or hybrid data ecosystems, where formal and informal, state and citizen-led, digital and analog, and I suppose local and non-local data infrastructures are being synergized. And it provides us with a roadmap to kind of bring these things together and recognize that this is the mainstay of urban development, right? It's not digital and it's not analog, it's not local, it's not non-local. It is all of these things happening in a hybrid and a blended way. And this, and others, and Rubbina, you've made this point as well, but this really is in sharp contrast with the push to formalize smart city infrastructures, right? So this, and Alex, your book, whether you like it or not, is going to be one of these moments that helps contend with this push to formalize these vast city-scale infrastructures and think about the local and non-local in slightly more nuanced ways. And I'm really glad that this discussion also is helping us along that path. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaideep. That was wonderful. And thank you so much for articulating these aspects around data infrastructure that I think it's opening up a set of possibilities here to continue these discussions and reflections. Adriana Allen, she has been a colleague, a friend with whom I worked for many years at the Development Planning Unit, a person I've learned a lot from, as well as institutionally, a place that, as I mentioned in my forward, has been a fundamental place to think about this ethics of engagement that also Rubbina made reference to it. So it's, notions like the room for maneuver, for example, that Mario Biggeri mentioned in the beginning, it's very much coming from that exposure. And then more recently, she became the president of the Habitat International Coalition, another wonderful network of civil society groups that puts the right to habitat at its center in terms of its advocacy and its mission. And also something that has been extremely influential in terms of the need to think about this rights-based approach to city making. So I'm really glad that you managed to be here with us. I know there was a clash in your diary, so thanks for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you so much, Alex, and let me start with a mandatory thanks and big congratulations for producing this book, but also for convening this event, this panel. Alex, I realized that in putting this event together, you push us all to put to the side anything else that we were hoping to read, was waiting on our bedside tables, and to prioritize your book. And I'm really glad I did that. And I invite everyone in the audience to do the same, because this is a book that does more than just bridging or connecting the capabilities approach with the urban world, and how we try to go about changing it. It does, in a very big sense, in my view, expand the scope and the boundaries of the capabilities approach. And it does that by practicing it, which is a typical thing that Alex does. So you won't find a lot about, being told. You will get new things as he does them. So in the interest of time, and because I want to listen to everyone, I hope we have some debate. I can see that we have an amazing group of participants in the audience. So I'm going to read very briefly some notes I wrote as I was reading Alex's book. And these notes concern 5 specific ways in which I think that Alex enacts or performs this expansion of the capability approach throughout the whole book. For me, the first one is in reframing the capabilities that can make cities better and more just places as fundamentally collective. This is an issue that came again and again and again in the discussion. And needless to say, this opens new ways of thinking about questions of material redistribution, a point that also Alex makes very clearly. He brings to the fore the importance of both market and non-market institutions in determining entitlements. And the consequence of the violations of entitlement rules in the complex crises and emergencies that typify most of the contemporary urban regimes in which we live. Regimes that manage more than urban goods and services, regimes that manage their social production and commoning. Across the chapters of his book, we encounter the multiple ways in which capabilities are crafted, through resistance, through claim, and through invited spaces. And to this effect, Alex claims that city-making practices take place in different ways, including collective and insertion forms of producing and using spaces, cooperative models, as well as private sector or state-led practices. Instead of closing down people's choices about how to make cities, a capability-oriented approach to city-making is concerned with revealing and expanding people's opportunities. And this is the end of his quote. His analytical contribution in this respect should not be underestimated. It invites us to see cities as how they are produced beyond the obvious, through the eyes and experiences of the women and men, girls and boys that build cities despite their status as birth citizens. So I want to go to a second key contribution or performance act in this book. And in this one also, Alex draws from a justice perspective and highlights the importance of recognition, but recognition as a form of developing intersectional and spatial situated sensibilities to observe more closely the questions of whose capabilities we are talking about and where. Taking us far beyond the site of individuals and collectives, the city center and the periphery, to the point where they merge, where they become a messy landscape of collective experiences and actions, shaped by place and intersectional identities across class, gender, race, and age. Across, perhaps more importantly, the social norms that shape these cross-social identities, such as whether you are a newcomer or an old settler, an outsider or an insider in a very deep sense. This reminds us that capabilities are to a large extent defined by belonging to some form of collective social force, whether this refers to informally claimed or formally enacted citizenship entitlements. A third crucial contribution in this book is that of exploring how changes to institutional capabilities can be activated from within and outside formal institutions through processes that craft a porosity and sensibility that institutions often lacked. And we heard a lot about that today. Sensibilities informed by the everyday and by social mobilization processes rather than just by legal and social norms. This is central to the work we do from the Habitat International Coalition, where we simultaneously seek to advance people's capabilities as human rights, very clearly inscribed in the United Nations systems, but also by seeking to enact the right to the city through everyday collective action and mobilization. In my view, institutions need to be occupied by new logics and experiences to develop a true political sensitivity to urban injustices. their calculating logics of numbers, statistics, and opportunity cost needs to shift to the logic of experience, the experience of urban poverty, of exclusion, stigmatization, and marginalization. This opens a space for a repoliticization of the norms and the normative approaches that have and continue to fail ordinary citizens, women, men, girls, and boys. And I really like some of the points that Jaideep raised just before about this. Fourth, for me, is the question of rights. What really activates the rights of women and men to be and become fully entitled citizens? Again, this is a question central to the work of HIC, which still begs further debate and practice. The question of rights is central to the development of capabilities, as the everyday experiences and city-making practices of the unsheltered are deeply linked to the politics of their citizenship. Through the Pueblos Jóvenes of Lima, the low-income settlements of Kisumu or favelas of Sao Paulo, everyday city makers find themselves struggling to secure land, housing, food, water, sanitation, and more widely, to participate in the construction of more just urban societies. In this sense, Alex takes us through a deep examination of the material world, the dwelling, the neighborhood, and the city, and of the practices and imaginaries that produce this material world. In doing so, he also opens a window into the macro politics of how capabilities are eroded or developed in the everyday of those who are politically and materially unsheltered. And I think that this is an amazing contribution, Alex. Last but not least is the question of learning. Again, a question that was raised by a few of you and also by Jaideep. This is for me a question of the critical pedagogies embodied in a reconceptualized practice of the capabilities approach. How do we learn to effect real change? What capabilities then need to be nurtured to that effect? These are very personal and very dear questions to me, and central to the work, again, we do at HIC in collaboration with the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, the KNOW program at the DPU. Platforms from which we are working tirelessly to develop new capabilities through cross-regional collaborative learning. And interestingly, we are starting with a wave that focuses precisely on one of the issues that we're focusing is precisely that one of advocacy and multi-level advocacy, connecting those dots, Jaideep, that you were talking about. Chapter after chapter, Alex takes stock of the learning that can be captured from the different stories that he shares with us. His book, I see his book, in fact, as a long act of reflexive learning, through which one can distill key principles and practices. Last week, I was talking to my youngest daughter about school during breakfast, and she was complaining about homework, about her teachers, dismissive comments about what she and others bring to the classroom, and I guess about the implicit rule that to learn, they should do what they are told to do. I then asked her, what do you feel? When do you feel that you learn? To which she replied, I feel I learn when I can do something I couldn't do before. And this is not always because I didn't know how to. Her words resonate with one of the key messages I found in Alex's book. We acquire new capabilities as we access emancipatory possibilities to learn and to act beyond the dictates of social norms and formal institutions. Thank you again, Alex.
Well, thank you so much, Adriana, for your thoughts and reflections. And yeah, fantastic. Really wonderful to hear that. I'm nearly embarrassed, but it's really, really nice to be part of these conversations and to bring these topics to the forefront and to reflect collectively. I wonder if there is any members of the attendees that would like to make any comment or ask a question. If so, we can also allow you to talk, to say the questions. So please just write in the chat, and we can see. In the meantime, I wonder if there are any comments or reflections from the panelists here, if you have any questions to each other or any reactions from what each other have brought up so far. Any of you would like to come in? And there were a few questions also in the chat. I think Claudia, you got a couple of them. Maybe you might want to to elaborate on, for example, this connection between design and planning, or also in terms of participatory consultation processes that you replied in a written form, but I wonder if you want to come back to it and elaborate a little bit further on that.
I could just use 1 minute because I don't want to take away time to the discussion. So basically the questions that I was made related to my saying during my contributions that the capability approach help us to bridge spatial planning policy and urban design. When I made this example, I thought of a concrete example, which is the Dutch policy for aging in place. So in the previous policy framework, there will be houses constructed for older adults. So it will be typical for older adults to move out of city centers, for example, and moving a bit further from the city centers and living into elderly houses. That policy has changed. So now the demographic compositions of cities is much more diverse and integrates older adults that will not be living in the city centers as before, let's say. This demographic change reflects a European trend of the populations being older and older, but also a global trend. Everywhere in the world, the population is becoming older. So there is a demographic transition which is of global relevance. How do we, that's the question, how can urban design accommodate an aging population? That's the question. My point is the capability approach provides us the instruments to formulate this question and to address these questions, both on the front of policy and on the front of how the design must adapt, the design of city must adapt to this demographic trend. So that's what I replied in the chat, and I'm just kind of synthetically now reported to you as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Claudia. And Mitchell, who has also been doing work in this field, thinking about capabilities in cities. So thank you very much for your comment and your question. It's a fantastic session. I completely support the idea that the capability approach provides a useful evaluative framework to understand and contributing to the development of cities. Do you believe the capability approach theories and concepts need to be augmented, altered in order to apply the approach to cities? Can you give some specific examples? Can these innovations in the capability approach propose inform the use of the capability approach in other contexts? I think if I could start picking that up, I think yes. I think that's one of the key aspects of the book and the chapter around practices that I was trying to articulate is that I think we need to alter some elements about the focus of the capability approach in itself, that just its application in its, let's say, more conventional way that we've been doing so far, putting the emphasis on goods and services. For me, it was not enough to start thinking about ways of producing city in ways we can use for projectively thinking about those interventions. And I think my work with architects and planners in this field, I feel that we need to make those let's say changes to the way we're thinking about it. And in my personal view, this will be applicable to other areas of action, independently if it's urban, also in other contexts of action planning in different fields. But again, I wonder if any other members of the panelists wants to come back to this question around the, let's say, the recalibration of the capability approach to engage with aspects of development in cities. Jaideep.
Thanks, Alex, and a fascinating question, actually, given the stage we are at the discussion. And I just wanted to perhaps pose the question a different way, because you know, cities don't mean the same thing across various contexts, and I think that's really important to keep in mind, that we don't end up axing our own feet by generalizing what urbanizing an approach means. So urbanization, I think, is the more relevant process, because, you know, as a number of us have pointed out, the process of urbanization doesn't happen linearly. It ascends, it descends, or in Brenner's word, it implodes and explodes, you know, all of that. So we need to find ways to localize these approaches. I think having a spatial or local sense might mean more. Equally though, there are, I suppose, city scales that cut across these various contexts. And you could, at the most rudimentary level, look at them from the point of view of size or morphology. But indeed, there is something, to me, that is unique about applying such an approach, for instance, in a mega region or a mega city, where the need or the nature of the complex system, to me, is different. But just as relevant as these issues to secondary or smaller towns that are engaging with the process of urbanization in new and emergent ways. And recently, I've been trying to think through what this means to small island states who've, for a long period, sat uncomfortably with this surge towards urbanizing everything. To a small island state, it means something very different to locate all of development thinking in urban infrastructure or indeed urban systems. So just to keep that slightly nuanced level, and there's an additional, because I see some colleagues from international multilateral organizations in the group, and it'll be nice to hear questions or views from them as well, is the role to internationalize this debate. So what does it mean for a hyper-local intervention to have a deep international influence? We have city networks, we have networks of city networks. This is a really rich and vibrant space, but it does mean that very localized development initiatives have a very international perspective as well. And you have to then contend with the capacities on the resource, but also on the human side, to deal with the tensions that sometimes come up. Those aren't easy aspects, but.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jaideep. And well, I'll then invite Ainara Fernandez. She's a part of the Global Observatory on Local Democracy and Democratization of United Cities and Local Governments. And yeah, maybe she can tackle this question that Jaideep just posed and how to bring that to the international discussion and the multilateral agencies. Ainara.
Thank you so much, Alex. And it's really been a great session so far. And your book has really pushed us to start thinking about how this capability approach can permeate, in particular, the work that we're doing regarding SDG localization, for instance, and what is the role, in particular, of local and regional governments when it comes to implementing the global sustainability agendas. But then also, it has led us to think about what are the implications of bridging the role of local and regional governments and the agendas that are trying to push for more just and sustainable city making that is also more participatory in an emancipatory way. So these are very big questions. And as I'm telling you, you're really pushing our boundaries here. And this is really inspiring, and it's also very challenging. And in particular, before Jaideep directly addressed city networks and a network of networks as UCLG, I had some comments that are indeed a concrete question in the sense of, so for me, there are two key entry points here that I wanted to comment on. The first one being this necessary shift from talking about basic needs to talking about aspirations. And then this particular necessity and the particular challenges posed by triggering change with respect to institutional capabilities. So for me, as somebody who works for United Cities and local governments, I really understand one of the key dimensions of the work of local and regional governments as being the guardians of local aspirations. And what you have been exposing today really made me think, how is it possible to operationalize this in terms of concrete institutional capabilities? And this was the question that I wanted to pose to you. And I think that it really links to the previous question and how Jaideep was particularly asking about how is this how can we internationalize this very local aspect of not only the capabilities approach, but development as a whole. So I'm sorry to be the kind of person that answers a question with another question, but this is who I am. I'm really sorry, but I'm also really excited to be here with you, and I'm really looking forward to your responses.
So now I think you've been hanging out with mayors for too long, because I think that's how they answer their questions, right? Asking you another question. But it's great to have your input and also your, I think, bringing that back, the institutional capabilities, which is something that's again coming back on over and over again in those conversations around trying to affect change and the usefulness of it. That I think in terms of thinking about how to build those institutional capabilities to bring about change and the different layers and scales that it operates, not only from the local but also the international layers that are important here. Brilliant. Do anybody wants to come back to these comments from Ainara? Does anybody wants like a reflection on that? Any inputs?
Maybe
yeah, Adriana. Sorry. Okay, let's go Adriana, and then there is Andrea and Anand. Great.
Okay, very quickly, because of the many hands. Thanks, Ainara, for the question. Just very briefly, I think that when it comes to local and regional governments, I mean, your work is obviously essential in terms of really expanding also the role of this protection that you refer to. And I think that, I mean, you are also fully aware from UCLG about the conflicted natures in which any of these roles of institutions that are invested to be, you know, the protectors, the enactors of any type of collective capabilities can work with many contradictions. So I think that a few things that were mentioned today are quite essential in the development of those institutional capabilities. For me, one has to do with the really opening eyes and ears, the changing the gaze. I think that it was Mario at the beginning that said what we see as a privation is often a word of opportunities. Mario said it with other words, but sometimes it's that easy. We really need to change our gaze and how we read the world. And a second key aspect, I think, is the institutional capabilities is also, in building institutional capabilities, is also to produce more feedback loops. And this is something, again, that was put on the table today. There are concrete mechanisms for this. Isn't participatory budgeting in the end one of those mechanisms where you are really saying, okay, you know, as you allocate resources, you really have to open them up and work with them and aggregate them again. So there is this constant work of aggregation and re-aggregation that Jaideep was referring to. I don't think that is aggregation, it's re-aggregation. No, it's a different type of exercise that happens through very concrete mechanisms. And again, I would think participatory budgeting, with all the challenges might face, is a very, very good and concrete example for that. I stop here.
Great, thank you. Andrea?
Yeah, let me just propose, why don't we organize for the future some sorts of policy colloquia between us and policymakers in other cities, also to bridge to better bridge between the capability approach and urban policymakers, because surely we have also an issue of language. So we have a complex approach, like a capability approach that needs, and we want to translate it into urban policies. But it may be not that easy for all policymakers around the world to really get what's behind complex and comprehensive concepts like the one included integral capability approach. So it could be interesting to have some sorts of policy colloquia in the future, whether we invite some policymakers that we already have contact with some others, and we explore how concepts like HDCA, or how the elements of your capability map, Alex, have been translated or could be translated into policy interventions in urban settings. So this could be also some sort of follow-ups of this this discussion for the future.
Thanks, Andrea. We are running a bit over time, but in Anand, in a nutshell, and then Claudia, I think, wanted to have a final comment.
Very briefly, I think it by its nature, it is an approach. And I think Professor Sain has mentioned many times that it is an incomplete theory of justice, in the sense that it provides us the framework, and then because injustices in a city are in many forms, they manifest in many different forms, in scale, in space, and in interactions. So I think here's a framework to look at that injustice and then to frame it. So I think Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom is going to be an essential part of capability approach. So, by its nature, it's going to be, it has to be adapted, it has to be local, it has to be different. And through that rich evolution, I think it creates these opportunities. Yeah. And I like the policy dialogue, so I'm very happy to support that. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you. Claudia?
I would just like to make a last comment on one question that there was in the chat, in continuity with the discussions that you are having now in the last minutes of our debate. That is, has the capability approach theory to be applied in such a way to have more impact on city planning? I just want to share again my reflections about the difference between planning professionals, within which I also include urban policymakers, and the community of planning scholars. They don't talk to each other. I'm saying this from the perspective of someone who, let's say, operates more in the community of planning scholars, theoreticians in particular. And in my experience, the penetration of new theories, especially when they are grounded on worldviews that are seen with suspect and instinctive hostility, is very difficult. On the contrary, the openness of planning practitioners to anything that helps them solving concrete questions with which they are, to which they are committed to professionally and personally, is much easier. On the other hand, I hope that debates like this one will motivate each of us to try to penetrate the theoretical debate in planning with the capability approach more and more, in such a way to overcome this, let's say, skepticism about its applicability, viability, very acceptability as a theoretical framework in the first place. So it's true that it is an incomplete theory, but I think that there is a lot that each of us can do by writing more on actual planning journals about all the misunderstanding and misconceptions that the capability approach has had up until now. And I hope, again, that I'm sure that Alex's book will be a great incentive now to do that. Or at least I want to thank you, because that kind of brings me back a bit to what I do love from the deepest. So I'm newly committed in a way to be part of this group of thinkers. Thanks.
Wonderful. Renewed energy is great. It's fantastic outcome. And I think great to finish here. Thank you so much. I think this has been a wonderful session. I really personally thank all of you. All of your inputs has been wonderful to get those reflections. But I think most importantly, I think for the field, I think we need to think about next steps. And I like Andrea's kind of idea around focusing on kind of policy dialogue and conversations. Anand, I saw you have a hesitant hand there, or no, it was all right. So, and with that, I think we will bring the session to a close. And thank you, HDCA Global Dialogue 2021, for giving this platform for us to have this conversation. And we will continue those reflections in due course. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thanks, Alex.